Sampson and Groves are two other theorists that emerged out of University of Chicago or the Chicago School. Sampson and Groves criticized Sean McKay for one really important reason. They argued that Sean McKay never defined social disorganization. So the first thing they do in 1989 in their Community Disorganization and Crime study is that they define social disorganization as the inability of a community to realize its common values. They then began to test social disorganization and the role that it plays in crime. So they looked at some similar neighborhood characteristics that Sean McKay outlined, in particular, poverty and heterogeneity. They redefine mobility to be lack of home ownership, and they add two other components: family disruption and urbanization. They argued that when you don't own your home, you're less likely to get involved with your community. They also described how family disruption can cause anonymity in a community. So kids don't know who all the adults are in those communities, who they should be trusting. And when you have a single family household, you're less likely to have time to participate in organizations such as a variety of community groups. So they looked at about 238 different localities, and they studied about 10,000 respondents, quite a large sample. And they described how in these communities, neighborhood supervision has broken down. Informal social control has broken down, and this has led to crime. So they measured informal social control in three different ways. The first is parochial. Parochial are your interpersonal networks. They're your institutions, your stores, your schools, your churches, your volunteer organizations. These are basically your extracurricular activities. So how involved are the adults in each of these? Then you have your private informal social control, your private groups. These are your family members and your friends. Finally, it's public. These are the ties that you have to agencies that are external to the community, such as police or municipal service agents. So they explain that when parochial or even private networks are weak, informal social control is weak. It is likely that informal social control will be weak when you have poverty, lack of home ownership, heterogeneity, family disruption, and urbanization. When you have weak informal social control, that means that the community is not able to protect itself. It's not able to prevent crime. So informal social control is linked then to your networks. Through your networks, you are able to identify problems in your community and in many ways come to the aid of those communities. And so we see this a lot with neighborhood watch programs. Both Sampson and Groves and Sean McKay would have been advocates for neighborhood watch type programs, right? These programs bring the community together to prevent crime in their own neighborhood. It is informal social control. It's not a formal social control agent like the police coming in. Instead, the community is making efforts to reduce crime. They've done a ton of studies looking at informal social control and social ties in these kinds of communities and whether or not that mediates the relationship between poverty, lack of home ownership, heterogeneity, family disruption, urbanization, and crime. And instead, they find that there is a large presence in these communities of community organizations. So the community organizations are there, and many people are part of those organizations. So the presence of these organizations then, for many of the studies demonstrate, isn't actually enough. And that leads me to the next theory. Sampson, Raudenbush, and Earls, 1997. This is the same Sampson from 1989. So Sampson, Raudenbush, and Earls extend the concept of social disorganization and they make it more modern, right? It's about 8 years or so since he wrote his first theory, and it's about 50 years or so since Sean Mackay first outlined social disorganization. Now, they argued that the presence of these organizations, the presence of these networks, the presence of parochial, private, public networks is insufficient to reduce crime. Instead, they argued for what they called active informal social control. So if you remember, Sampson and Groves just mentioned informal social control, but Sampson, Raudenbush, and Earls are talking about active informal social control. And what that means is, it means you want people calling the police when something bad is happening. You want people intervening when there's a fight going on in the street. You want people to come to the rescue of those who are clearly in trouble. You want someone to yell at teenagers when they are misbehaving. You want what they describe as collective efficacy. So they take the same community characteristics, well, very similar anyway. Poverty, residential instability, heterogeneity, family disruption. Because at this point, cities are already highly urban and the industrialization movement has already happened. So they look at these characteristics and they look at collective efficacy, which they define as social cohesion combined with a willingness to intervene on behalf of the common good. If there's no collective efficacy, that will lead to crime. So if the community is not cohesive, if individuals are not willing to intervene on behalf of the community, then you experience crime. And most studies show that this is actually the case, that members of communities who are more likely to intervene have less crime. Think about that. How many of you actually intervene when you see something happening in your neighborhood? I want to take you back to the concentric circles one more time, because as I'm sure you know, cities aren't mapped this way anymore. We still see some of the similar patterns, right? We still find crime concentrated in particular communities, right? The social ecology of crime, where crime rates vary by units. But Sean Mackay, even Sampson and Groves, would have expected that just like every other immigrant group who moved into the zone in transition and eventually made it in America and moved out to the other zones, they expected other groups living in those zones to eventually make it out of those zones. So they argued this was like a very basic, natural social process, which led to some significant criticisms of these social disorganization theories, because these theories did not investigate why these communities have such high poverty. Why do these communities have fewer individuals who actually own homes? Why is there a high rate of family disruption in these communities? And why aren't all racial and ethnic groups who move into those communities able to make it and then move out? They argue that this is a natural process, but they fail to recognize what policies and decisions have been made that have shaped social ties, social networks, collective efficacy, that have shaped family disruption, poverty, and residential instability. And that leads us to our next theory.